aftermath of the war, with the acquisition of the Philippines, what becomes of paramount importance to American business interests is sort of becoming involved in Asiatic trade, particularly in China. And so China becomes the market, the coveted market for American business people. If the Spanish-American War results in colonial possessions that allow for and facilitate trade with China, great. The problem, however, is the United States is late to come into China. And the other problem is that China is weak. And so the fear that the United States has is that European powers and Japan will carve up China into colonies and will be shut out. Hence, the policy of the United States government with China is called a ways what? What do we want in China? We say we want it. John Hay, the then Secretary of State, articulates it. Our policy with China, beginning in 1901, is, dear Aways, the...
Let me think.
Hands are everywhere, Aways. Hands are everywhere. Well, maybe not. Go ahead, Natalie. The open door. The open door with China. Oh, Ellen, just for fun, this is, and I think it will be fun, just for fun, what was the Boxer Rebellion and how did that have anything to do with the open door? That's okay, Ellen. I'll just call on Lindsay for that. Lindsay, what was the Boxer Rebellion and what did that have to do with the open door?
We are committed to China for free trade.
Well, that's true, dear Lindsay, but the old Boxer Rebellion. Boxer, put up your dukes. Boxer Rebellion. Melissa, you have studied the Boxer Rebellion in some length, have you not?
Somewhat.
Do you recall anything of it?
Not really.
Darn it, go ahead, Maya.
Over the sphere of influence that was
Well, the sphere of influence was problematic to the Chinese. The Boxer Rebellion was a rebellion of the Chinese, yes.
Didn't they want to kill foreigners and their influence?
Yes, they wanted foreigners out, and foreign influence out. And the eventual result of the Boxer Rebellion is an international force that the United States participates in, is sent, Emory, to put down the Boxer Rebellion. And they do. The Boxer Rebellion is also reason for the United States to reiterate its policy in China, which is the open door. And to emphasize that the open door in China included China's territorial integrity. We were committed to the open door, and we were committed to China being a sovereign and independent country in which all nations could trade. Now, that's more a concept than it is a reality. And that reality is something that the incoming president of the United States has to deal with. And we say the incoming president of the United States in 1900, William McKinley, takes on William Jennings Bryan for the second time. William Jennings Bryan was the fair-haired Democratic candidate for president in 1896 who robustly campaigns across the country under the sort of issue of the free and unlimited coinage of silver, and is dramatically defeated by William McKinley in 1896. By 1900, the issues in that campaign had shifted from the free and unlimited coinage of silver to imperialism. Regardless, McKinley was reelected, largely because the United States enjoyed some level of prosperity during McKinley's administration. McKinley added, and the Republicans added to the ticket in 1900, a young popular governor from New York, Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was McKinley's Republican running mate. So when McKinley was dramatically assassinated in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt ascended to the presidency. And we talked about Theodore Roosevelt as president from two vantage points. We talked about him diplomatically, and we talked about him as a progressive. Now, we talked about him diplomatically when we elected him into, or we didn't elect him into office, when he ascended to office in 1901, and he began to sort of assert his ideas about America, the world, and foreign policy. Remember, Amoya, that Theodore Roosevelt was associated as a jingo. He was a militaristic expansionist. And that expansionism is reflected probably more than anything in the acquisition and construction of the Panama Canal. Now remember, the Panama was a part of Colombia, who eventually sought its independence from Colombia kind of violently, and the United States had a role in that. Remember, U.S. troops blocked the Colombians from landing in Panama to put down the insurrection, and we promptly recognized Panama as an independent country, and then made a deal with the newly formed Panamanian government for a canal zone through Panama. And yes?
Where was the first place they're gonna make the...
Nicaragua.
Okay.
Right? There was 2 sites, Nicaragua and Panama. And so Roosevelt is responsible for the Panama Canal eventually being constructed where it was and how it was. Now, to some extent, not everyone thinks that what happened with the Panama Canal is something to be proud of, but certainly Roosevelt made dirt fly by the 1904 election and is something he wanted to do. Another thing that we talked about with Roosevelt in terms of foreign policy was something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary, I can picture this I'm picturing the advanced placement United States history test. I'm picturing you kids sitting in this room. I'm picturing a question about the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and I'm picturing the euphoria that you kids have in being able to successfully answer that question, Samantha. The euphoria. Because the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine basically said that the United States would serve as the policeman. Yes, go ahead, dear Cornell. As the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. If European powers had problems with Latin American countries, who, dear McMurtry, were historically unstable, that those European powers should see the United States, that we would set things right. Now, we talked about Roosevelt in terms of foreign affairs, and we talked about the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but we also then talked about Roosevelt as a progressive, and we talked about progressivism. And what we said that progressivism was kind of the political, economic, social ideology that began to permeate the country around the turn of the century. And if we wanted to describe it in any way, we said that progressivism was, and I think your textbook says it this way, Brahani, that progressivism was more a mood than it was a movement. A mood that there were problems that had resulted in the society that were results of industrialization and urbanization, and that these problems were glaring and dangerous, and that these problems needed to be addressed in order to perpetuate the United States, for things to stay as they had been or we would hope they would be. So the progressives were a particular group of people, and we profiled them. We said, look, the progressives typically were white, Anglo-Saxon, upper middle class, well-educated, urban Protestants. That these were people who saw America sort of changing in certain ways, and they feared these changes. They feared the power and domination of political bosses and big trusts being increasingly consolidated and yielding sort of disproportional power. They feared radicalism on the left. They feared, the labor movement and communism and socialism and anarchism and those things, and the urban poor being sort of inspired by radicals and potentially overthrowing the stability of the society. And so in order to keep things stable, they wanted to fix the worst abuses in society. To some extent, these urban reformers, these people that wanted to fix things, were inspired by a new type of journalism that was called muckraking. And remember, we said that muckraking was different from yellow journalism, although they both sought sensational stories, stories that would sell magazines or newspapers, but the muckrakers sought to tell the truth about what happened, to expose the expose, to expose the worst defects in society. Thus, exposing those defects would result in sort of an inspiration by people to push government to try to fix things. Who do we associate? What authors do we associate with muckraking? Dear Kuhnel. Oh, Upton Sinclair, his book was named A Ways